What is the role of philosophy in history? Do philosophers come up with ideas that spread and influence the world, or are their works the accumulation of the advances of society? How do good ideas spread, and is this a time for optimism? Today's episode of Classical Wisdom Speaks is with Robert Trzcinski, editor of Symposium, a journal of liberalism, and author of the Trzcinski Letter, as well as a senior fellow at the Atlas Society. We'll be looking at the relationship between philosophy and history, the Thales objection, and Robert's idea on the virtuous circle. But before we get started, a quick reminder to please check out classicalwisdom.substack.com to sign up for our free newsletter. We are a reader-supported publication, and it's our wonderful community that help makes our site and this podcast possible. Now, what went right? So I love that you have written a book called What Went Right, an objectivist theory of history, just because, we kind of live in a world right now where everyone focuses on the doom and the gloom. So it's actually quite refreshing to have somebody say a positive outlook, especially when we do genuinely have so much. So I just think it's very wonderful to focus on the positive from time to time.
That was really the impetus. That there's I find this actually to be a big problem in American politics, that the catastrophism, the belief that everything's collapsing, leads people to panic into bad solutions and to embrace a populist strongman because, well, everything's going down the hill. We need somebody to save us. And it leads to both on the right and the left, this sort of catastrophism leads to a desire to burn the whole system down, rather than and to forget all the things that are going right and all the things that are good about the system that we have. And so it leads people to take bad solutions. So this really came out of there's been a lot of talk about progress recently, and Steven Pinker had a book called Enlightenment Now, which is all about it. And there's a whole field of progress studies that's coming up. The impetus for this book came about 15 years ago. So I sort of say I was into progress before it was cool, because it was kind of early on, but it was this realization that, wait a minute, that we need to take into account all the things that have gone right and have an explanation for that. We need to understand why that went right so it can keep going right in the future.
I think that's very well said. And, people have a tendency to romanticize the past, to kind of purify it and say, oh, back then when everybody had virtues and values and such. However, you spend enough time looking at the Julio-Claudian dynasty and you go, are you sure about that? So I think it's really valuable whenever assessing anything to be honest and show both sides of it. So I think that's wonderful. But it's being classical wisdom, we kind of do focus on the ancient world. I do have to ask, in what ways did the ancient world sort of contribute to what went right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're at the root of a lot of what went right, because if you look at but by the way, I should mention part of my background is in classics. That I studied classics at the University of Chicago, mostly because I was a big fan of Aristotle, so I wanted to know enough Greek to be able to sort of get behind the translations. I'm very rusty on my Greek, so don't test me on it right now. But I was interested in Aristotle, and I got into classics and into reading the ancient Greeks. And practically every field of knowledge that we have today, you go back and the Greeks started it, or they started the sort of rational scientific version of it. So, history, even the ones they didn't start, like, geometry and astronomy, they didn't start. Those were going enterprises to some extent, but they put them on a more, a much firmer foundation and advanced the methods tremendously. But, history, literature, Greek tragedy basically invented what we think of as the modern plot. I won't say modern, but the Western, the idea of a plot and a plot progression, all that was invented by the Greeks. And you go through every field, medicine, physics, mathematics, and they either invented or advanced every single field. So it is the foundation for everything that comes after it in Western civilization. Although I'm also looking at this in terms of what was the foundation for the Greeks? What did they come out of?
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you kind of bring up this role of the history, I mean, the role of philosophy in history. And I'd love for you to kind of go into your theory about this because, it is really interesting and it maybe is not as intuitive or it's counterintuitive than the kind of normal way of thinking about philosophy of it being top down versus cumulative. But I'll let you explain it as I suspect you can do it much better than myself.
Well, yeah, just to give a brief summary, and of course it's all in, I gotta, as an author, I gotta hold up, it's all in the book, which you can get. But the the impetus for this is coming out of, it's called an objectivist theory of history. So this is coming out of the objectivist movement, the ideas of Ayn Rand and the philosophy that she advocated. And part of that philosophy was about the importance of ideas and the importance of philosophy. She was a great salesman, basically, for not just for her philosophy, but for the importance of philosophy and big ideas as such. And that influenced her idea of her view of basically the philosophy of history, of the question of what moves history. And the idea is that ideas move history, that people come up with big ideas and then they attempt to implement them. They tend to put them into practice. And those ideas lead to the results that you can then see, so if they embrace Marxist ideas, you get a Marxist society and you get, the Soviet Union. If they embrace the idea of individual rights or Enlightenment ideas, you get the United States and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and you get a free society that's built up. So the idea is ideas have consequences, ideas move history. And I think that's absolutely true. But this theory is sort of a little bit of a correction to that, in the sense that the idea that ideas move history came to be interpreted as the idea that it all comes top down, right? So that, some philosopher sitting up on an ivory tower or at the philosophy faculty at Harvard University embraces an idea, puts it out there, and then it sort of goes down and everything else comes from that. It is the source for everything else in the culture. So all of our literature, all of our music, all of our ideas about politics, about economics, about psychology, all of it just comes propagating downward from some, philosophical grand poobah. And so I was sort of challenging that, because for one thing, I put out, if that was the case, if it was that a few elite philosophers at the top universities dictated everything, we'd be in much worse shape than we are right now. We wouldn't have, if we consider the vogue, for example, that communist ideas had in the early 20th century, and how universal it was among the intelligentsia. If that was the only impact, we would have already proceeded on to the dystopia, basically, that we'd be expecting. So my theory is that ideas move history, but also philosophy moves history, but also that history moves philosophy. That the events, when people go out and they accept an idea and they put it into practice, it produces results, and then people learn from that results and they react to that results. But also, I think you described it as being cumulative. I would say it's not just top down, it's bottom up. That the things that people are doing, the intellectual activity that people are engaging in a whole wide variety of different fields, that economists are doing and psychiatrists are doing, and also that ordinary people are doing in terms of just, building new enterprises and the things they're doing in their lives, those have a bottom up influence. That good ideas come up from other fields and not just down from philosophy into those fields. And so I provided numerous examples, but one of the examples I focus on, which would be of interest to you, is looking at the history of ancient Greece and saying, well, it's not just that you had a few philosophers that came along and said, here are these great ideas, now go out, and then we have the golden age of Athens. It was actually kind of the opposite. You have the golden age of Athens with things bubbling up in all the sciences and politics and all of that. And you had this golden age of Athens, and then you had the great Greek philosophers who were then looking at everything that had been done and drawing the big conclusions. I think Aristotle is the one who sort of pulled it all together into a system. So the idea is that there's this reciprocal, there's this sort of virtuous cycle. And I view ancient Greece as the sort of kicking off of this great virtuous cycle, where certain intellectual achievements then produce the foundation for the foundation in facts, the foundation in actual a base of knowledge from which to draw big important new philosophical conclusions. Those philosophical conclusions then can be used to unlock, and make it possible to do even more with that knowledge. And then you get, hopefully, this virtuous cycle where you build on it and you get to more and more knowledge building on itself, but with this reciprocal relationship between philosophy and everything else.
Now, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to think of these sort of building on each other, when I find sometimes the history of the philosophers in ancient Greece sometimes were reactionary. So it's like maybe the idea of Aristotle being cumulative of the science of math, does that work with Plato? And if Aristotle is kind of going in complete direct opposition to Plato at times, and Plato sometimes being opposite to Socrates, they don't seem to even add on top of each other specifically.
Well, I think in some ways they do. For example, I think you confuse. I mean, Socrates is sort of the guy who starts off philosophy as a fully developed field. Now, he's not the first philosopher. There are people doing things before him. But I think what Socrates did, and the funny thing about Socrates is we don't know all that much about what he himself actually said. None of he didn't write anything that we can read. So none of that. If we get it all indirectly through Xenophon and through mostly through Plato. But what we have a general idea of is that he's the guy who really defined what all the big questions were and defined the sort of the method of arriving at conclusions through this sort of rational discussion and breaking, the whole Socratic dialogue approach, right? Where you ask these questions and you analyze everything and you reject and approve of certain things based on what emerges from that discussion. So there's this whole method. The questions and the method of philosophy are defined by him. And I think that's something that is building off of everything that came before, that you had, all these people sort of proto-philosophers or very early philosophers who were oftentimes scientists and rhetoricians. And they were probing all the big questions and producing a base of knowledge from which Socrates could then say, okay, here are the questions, and here's the basic method of a rational approach to philosophy, as opposed to religion or musings or the sort of the typical wise man of the sort of pre-philosophical era, who was just a guy who would go and state a bunch of aphorisms, right? and what would come down would be a bunch of sayings from some wise man. He took that and turned, building on all the stuff that had been done before. Socrates is the one who turned that into this sort of systematic field of inquiry. But what Socrates said about the conclusions he came to were less important than him simply defining what the questions were. I think Plato you can see as a reaction against the rational philosophy, the emerging sort of rationality of his era, because I really view Plato's system as a way of taking that philosophical breakthrough made by Socrates, but then trying to use it to state in rational philosophical terms a sort of retreaded version of mysticism, right? Because the whole idea of Plato is to find the truth, you look inward, to your own intuitions inside your head, rather than looking outward at reality. So it's like he's trying to put into the form of this rational philosophical method pioneered by Socrates. He's trying to put into that form a statement of the sort of mystical worldview, that truth comes from looking inward to have these intuitions or revelations. And then I think I see him as a transition to, on the one hand, he clearly had a big influence in Aristotle. He nurtured Aristotle. The school that he created is what Aristotle came out of.
Of course.
But
yeah.
Aristotle takes that method and the questions of a fully developed field of philosophy as a well-defined field of inquiry, and he brings to it the fullest statement, up to his time, and for many thousands of years afterwards, the fullest statement of the rational worldview and the rational epistemology that had been emerging out of the golden age of Greece. That you had the early scientists and mathematicians and astronomers, etc. I'm a big fan of Thucydides. So the idea of having, he's the guy who sort of solidified the idea of scientific history, that you have a whole methodology by which you determine what actually happened, as opposed to the legends and the stories people are telling. So, you have all of that developing before Aristotle comes along, and he is the one who comes up with the deepest and broadest sort of philosophical summation and examination and analysis of what's behind that worldview.
I can definitely tell you're a fan of Aristotle, as am I. Now, you have mentioned quite a few times the early philosophers and the pre-Socratics, and I'm a big fan of the pre-Socratics, so much so that I've been advocating that we stop calling them pre-Socratics because it seems diminutive, and we should be calling them like the first philosophers. I'm working on my rebranding campaign for them. But I have seen in a response to your book, in your newsletter, which I thought was very interesting, called the Thales Objection, which I thought was great because, of course, Thales comes much earlier than Aristotle, and he obviously had quite a huge impact. And I mean, one thing I love about him is the rational approach to things, and you know, predicting the solar eclipse and being scientific, and that thought process I thought was quite revolutionary.
Oh, yeah,
But why don't
absolutely.
you tell us your response to the Thales objection?
So the Thales objection is my term for it, but it was a sort of a counter argument made against, because, you know, if I'm saying it doesn't all come top down, it comes bottom up. And if you're going to come up with a way to support the top down view, Thales is your man. Thales is the guy he's the best person to take on as an example of, no, it does come top down, because he did really come super early. I mean, he's very early, like, you know, the 600s BC, you know, late
623 to 545 BC. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, but his main stuff is like 585 in
super early.
that,
yeah.
Right. So it's super early. If you look at it actually on a timeline, you know, if you look at Anaximander and all these other people coming along, everything else comes like a generation or so later after him. So you can think, okay, maybe he's the guy who set the spark. And I think there's something to that. Now, the two big things that I take out of Thales. Again, Thales is another guy, like Socrates, only more so, where we don't have any of his works. You know, we don't really know exactly what he said. What we have is people referring to him in other later works, often works from centuries later, right? So we don't, there's this limited knowledge we have of who he was and what he did. But the main things he's credited with that I found interesting, there's the prediction of the solar eclipse, using now there were people who predicted solar eclipses before. Astronomy was a field that was already in full swing. The Babylonians had done a lot. The Egyptians had done a lot. But he had developed a new and supposedly more reliable method to predict an eclipse. But what I found most interesting is he had one thing he did in physics and one thing he did in geometry. So in physics, he had this idea that everything was made of water, right? And that is really, it's like a primitive view of the idea that, you know, I think he was looking at the phase change of water. You know, that water can be a solid, it can become ice, it can be a liquid, it could be a gas, and then said, what if everything's all made out of one thing and it's just taking on different forms? And the theory itself is not exactly right, but what's revolutionary about the theory is the idea of a natural explanation for everything. That, you know, you have this sort of natural physical explanation for everything that goes on in the world, instead of, you know, a god, you know, what would have been typical at the time, which is a god came and caused this thing to move. You know, there was this very primitive animistic kind of view that was still common. And his idea that, no, everything has a physical cause. You can understand everything in terms of its physical causes. And that produces, like, about a century after Thales, you get, for example, the Hippocratic school. And the famous article there is, the famous work is on the sacred disease. And this is the idea of their explanation for epilepsy, because epilepsy had been viewed as the sacred disease. It was caused by a god, basically a god or demon was possessing you. So it had a magical, mystical, otherworldly cause. And this was arguing that, no, it has a natural cause. We just have to understand what it is. And so, you know, all of this, you can see this as coming back to Thales. The other big thing he did was he's credited with the first geometric proof. So like a geometric proof in the way we would think of it, as like a formal chain of reasoning to demonstrate a philosophical truth. A geometric idea. So, you know, the field of geometry predates the Greeks. It also comes from, you know, the Babylonians and the Egyptians. And there's some legends that Thales studied in those places in Babylon or Egypt. Nobody really knows for sure, but that he then took it to this next level of discovering, well, here's this way of proving these things, that you have this systematic logical proof. And it is the basis for a lot of what comes later. So if you're going to make a case for this sort of top-down view, Thales is your guy. It's a very plausible case. But what I point out is that Thales came from, I mentioned this legend that he studied geometry, supposedly either in Babylon or in ancient Egypt. He came from this environment, this sort of intellectual ferment of the very early Greek world. And they were sort of sandwiched among all these other big civilizations, to the east of them, and the Egyptians, and they borrowed things from the Egyptians, and they learned a lot of things from them. And the geometry and astronomy and things like that were I won't say well-developed sciences, but they were going concerns and had been for quite some time. So my point is that, on the other hand, you could say Thales is the root of a lot of things. A lot of things come down from him, but at the same time, he doesn't come out of nowhere. He comes out of this whole environment. He's, I think I linked to your page and talking about the 7 sages of ancient Greece, and there's disagreement about who the sages were, but there were these, Solon was one of them, Thales was one of them, but there were, these other, and people disagree as to who the 7 were, but depending on which source you go from. But there were these, sort of wise men who, were coming up with interesting new ideas, and were famous at the time for this. And it was a time of this tremendous intellectual ferment, coming out of, thousands of years prior to that, of the slow but steady development of things like geometry and mathematics and astronomy. So, I think, there's sort of a chicken and egg question of like, which came first, the philosopher who defines a great idea, and then the scientists, et cetera, the people who then put that into practice and implement it. But I think we actually do know who came first, because we know philosophy begins at a certain point. So there must have been something else happening before that, right? So we know that human intellectual development does not begin with philosophy. So we know that something must have come before that. There had to be some base of development and knowledge for people to be able to start developing these philosophical ideas. So I think that the question of which came first is not really the question. The question, I think, is you have to understand the reciprocal relationship between the two, that when a philosopher comes up with a great new idea, yes, it's going to totally inspire a lot of things that other people are going to do coming after that. But then they're going to do new things in their own fields, and maybe just in medicine and just in astronomy and just in history or whatever. And those new ideas they come up with are then going to have to be reabsorbed by and inspire the philosophers to come up with new conclusions. So I think it has to be a reciprocal relationship, or a virtuous circle.
It is amazing, this idea of trying to understand the movement of history, and then specifically the history of philosophy, that whether it's sort of the great man philosophy or the great tide. And of course, my favorite analogy of this is in the second epilogue of War and Peace, when, Tolstoy sort of describes Napoleon. Is he the tugboat in front of the giant ship, or the dinghy out the back? It's tricky, though, because sometimes there are people who do seem very reactionary to events and history and culture. And then there are sometimes individuals that seem to really propel movements forward. And it's interesting, too, because there's some philosophers, for instance, that are, at their time, they're seen almost as gods, because, I think of Pythagoras or somebody like that. And I think Thales also was often considered a god. So at least in their community, the people were so astounded by the ideas that they were bringing that they had to attribute, deify them almost.
I think the great man theory of history is interesting, because I do think, we have to acknowledge the existence of great men. There are certain individuals who are irreplaceable, who come along and, for good or ill, do something that would not have happened without them. But at the same time, a great man is just one person, right? One person can inspire others to act, but he needs other people to be doing those things. Napoleon forms his army. He needs his marshals, and he needs his generals, and he needs his the soldiers, and he needs the whole social context to be ready for that to happen. So he comes. He didn't make the French Revolution. He comes along in the wake of the French Revolution, which arguably unleashed the forces. The big thing one of the big things Napoleon had in his that revolutionized the approach to warfare was the ability to mobilize large numbers of ordinary citizens, that war was no longer the province of It wasn't no longer an aristocratic thing where the sons of the aristocrats would learn swordcraft and go off to fight. It became a mass phenomenon where you'd recruit the poor from the streets of Paris, and you give them rifles and you train them, and then you would have this massive army of hundreds of thousands of men that you could go off and get them all killed trying to take Moscow. But so you had to have this great man, this brilliant general who was able to achieve all these amazing victories that maybe somebody else could not have achieved, up until the point he got overconfident. So you had to have the great man who could do that, but at the same time, you also had to have the social context that gave him that ability to inspire and recruit people and to build this new kind of army that hadn't really happened before. And and even the fact that Napoleon, part of the mythology of Napoleon was the fact that he came in as the great leader who was saving the French Revolution, right? Because at the time you'd had the Terror, and then you'd had this weakened, the French Revolution had been weakened from the inside by Robespierre and the Terror, and they were trying to sort of recover from that, and at the same time it was beset from the outside by all these enemies. And so they viewed him, as this great figure, sort of like a George Washington type. And then you see him sort of slowly subvert that over a period of years, from being the citizen leader who's going to save the revolution to being the guy who's basically restoring a new monarchy with himself as the emperor. And so again, there's a whole context there of how he was able to do that. And so you have the great man who's doing things for good or ill, both. And at the same time, you have to have the context to be prepared for him. So I think it's both. It's not that, that Napoleon's not just a dinghy. He is driving the ship, but somebody had to build the ship, or the materials at least had to be there to build the ship, right? Yeah, or else he couldn't have done it.
I often like to think of it as a surfer analogy, that you have these sort of waves of history, and then you can have people who might know how to navigate them well or not, but that they kind of ride that wave, so to speak. But it's interesting. So you're talking about this virtuous cycle, but of course, progress does not go in a straight line, and sometimes we go up and sometimes we go down. So what breaks that cycle, that circle, and what makes us go backwards?
Well, so one of the arguments I make here is I think the top-down approach to philosophy does apply to how bad ideas spread. That oftentimes you have somebody, you come up with somebody who has a theory that they want to be true, and they try to impose that on everything, right? So you have, and I noticed this. I mean, when I went off to college, both Marxism and Freudianism were still in vogue, and oftentimes you got these very amusing attempts to combine Marxism and Freudianism. So it was sex and economics all somehow are the material factors that are moving everything.
It sounds terrifying.
It was mostly
sexual
funny,
economics.
Yeah, I know. I found it mostly very amusing because it really didn't work very well. But you had these systems, and I do remember you get into reading this and you realize this system is kind of airtight. Had the whole logical consistency in amongst itself, that you could explain everything in the world. And once you had this theory, and it would seem to be this self-contained system that explains everything, and it was amazing. It would open up your mind. And if you got pulled in by that, and people did get pulled in by that, what you would do is you would try to explain absolutely everything in the world by reference to this philosophical theory, and ignoring what the message coming back of what the world is trying to tell you is actually happening, right? And you would ignore the results. You would ignore anything that didn't fit the theory. So I think that sort of top down, somebody taking the beautiful consistency of this theory and trying to impose it on all of the world is often how you break this chain of the virtuous cycle, and you stop looking at the results that reality is giving you. And the persistence of communism is an amazing example of that. And even to today, that a couple of years ago, the New York Times had a whole series, like a year-long series of articles commemorating or celebrating almost the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution in 1917. So in 2017, they have this whole series of articles. And it's amazing how, the whole story of the Russian Revolution and then communism in Soviet Union was a story of massive failure. But there were all these articles trying to sort of rewrite that history and whitewash it as well. Really, there was a lot of good things about it. And it showed the extent to which people persist, in the face of so much evidence that 100 million people dead from communism across the world, at the very least, that people will persist in saying, no, 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 this theory has to be true. Let me rewrite things. And you don't get, communism is a great example of not getting that feedback in the virtuous cycle of reality giving you the results and you saying, oh, wait a minute, I have to revise my theory based on the results from reality.
Now, I wanted to also ask about how the relationship of philosophy and science sort of interconnected when it came to much later philosophy, like the continental philosophy and the sort of science of the subjective experience. And I'm saying this in part because I don't know if you know Aaron Smith with the Ayn Rand Society, who also is a expert in Aristotle. So you guys probably have quite a bit in common. And I saw him speak not that long ago down here in Buenos Aires. And, he kind of just said everything went wrong with Kant. And I was like, I'm not sure I'm going to go that far, but I was interested if the philosophies that sort of ask you to not necessarily take the rational break that cycle as well.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I actually agree with the idea that Kant, it's sort of objectivism 101. Yeah, Ayn Rand had set up Kant as the big bad guy. And I think she's right. There was actually a philosopher of the time, the early 19th century, who called him the all destroyer. And I think it's because, the big sort of landmine laid by Kant was the idea that he was trying to say that he was setting up the idea that he was saving us from skepticism, right? So David Hume had come along and said all these things that seemed to be just outright subjectivism and solipsism, and all you really know is a bunch of appearances in your head, and you can't really know what reality is outside of that. It seemed to be radically subjective. And Kant came along and supposedly provided an answer to that. But I think what he did is he simply repackaged this Humean skepticism in a form that made it look like it was an answer to subjectivism, but was actually enshrining subjectivism. And it was this idea that, all you really know is things as they appear to you. You can't know the reality behind that. And things as they appear to you, and this is the crucial part of Kant, which is things as they appear to you are determined by your own identity. It's the identity of your consciousness that causes them to appear in a certain way. So you can't say whether that's the way things really are in the real world out there. The real world out there is the phrase that sort of bounces through the culture that just gets on my nerves, because it embodies this whole idea. Think of it as the real world out there. So thinking of the real world as something that's off in some other area that you're not in contact with. In reality, the real world is, you're in it. It's all around you. You are part of it. But the real world out there, that phrase sort of represents that mindset of, no, you're just, you're in this subjective illusion. And that illusion is shaped by your identity of who you are as a person. And the real world is something out there in some mysterious other place that you can't access. And that's the mentality that Kant created. And I think you see that a lot today. In America, we have what was called wokeness or political correctness. And it is, I think, the descendant of Kantianism, because it takes this idea that, well, you see the world a certain way, you think certain things are true, but that's only because you're a cis white male, a cisgender, heterosexual white male, and that's why you see things the way you do. But other people with different identities see things a different way, and that's this idea of your identity shapes the world that you perceive and makes it this subjective bubble that you are trapped in, and there's no way to get to a set of common facts in a real world out there. That's the legacy of Kant. And I think it absolutely cuts off the virtuous cycle that I'm talking about, because the virtuous cycle has to start with the idea that, look, I have certain theories and ideas. We're going to act on them. We're going to put them into practice in the world. But then we have to look at how they work out. And also we have to be open to the idea that, somebody's going to go out and do something that our theory didn't predict, or something that we didn't expect. And that thing is going to have tremendously good results. And we have to take that on board and understand, all right, so what is this new idea somebody came up with? How do we understand it? How do we explain it? How do we analyze it? How do we take on board that new thing and be open to ideas that come from outside of our theories? And so I think that the Kantian method, I think it's more the Kantian method than anything else. I had a great professor, but he did something terrific in one of my classes, and we were studying Aristotle. Like a 2-quarter long seminar on graduate level seminar on Aristotle's Nicomachean and ethics. And the first things he does, he puts up on the blackboard, he puts up the first sentence of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and the first sentence of Kant's Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. So the first one of Aristotle, I'm going to do it from memory, it's not going to be exact, but like every art and undertaking seems to aim at some goal, and therefore it has been said that the good is that at which all things aim. And then the first sentence of Kant is, there is nothing that can be conceived in this world or out of it that is good without qualification except the good will. And notice the difference between them is Aristotle is entirely outward looking, right? He says, well, let's look at all these arts and undertakings and all this human action that people are engaged in, and let's try to identify what the common characteristic is of all these actions that they're undergoing. All these people out there pursuing goals, and so maybe pursuit of goals is important. Whereas Kant it's all inward. What can we conceive? There's nothing that can be conceived. Let's look inward to your mind and to your own conceptions. Let's look inward at your own will and your intentions and all that. It's all very inward looking. And I think that's the real legacy of Kant, and the legacy of bad philosophy is it becomes this inward looking closed circle where you are only looking at the things that come from your theory and fit with your theory, and not at all the things going on in the world outside you.
It really is amazing to try to think about the world in which how we come to understand our knowledge, of course, whether we can just trust our senses, whether we have to use reason and logic. I mean, I always thought one of the great insights of Kant is that sometimes you have to merge those two, in that, our senses tell us that the sun is going around the earth, and that we have to use logic and mathematics and reason to determine it's not what our senses see.
Well, I think that I like Aristotle better on that, though, because he's the guy who, the thinking method that is so typical of Aristotle, and anybody who's read Aristotle knows this, is the fact that we don't have his dialogues, we don't have his popular works, we have his lecture notes, and so we get this full bore, this method, in a way that's almost annoying sometimes. It's like, well, let's take this idea and let's pick it apart into all of its constituent parts and consider all the possible answers, and parsing everything to within an inch of its life. But that it comes from this idea, every time you have a conclusion, you have to analyze all the specific elements of that conclusion. Make sure you have the exact use of all your terms. So, for example, Aristotle would say, our senses don't tell us that the sun goes around the earth. Our senses tell us that the sun becomes visible above the horizon, that it moves relative to the sky to a certain point, but it doesn't tell us anything about how to interpret that. And how to interpret that is something that we then have to, our senses give us data, they don't tell us how to interpret it. How we interpret that is then up to us using logic and more, further observations and developing conclusions from that. So I think Aristotle has the right method. The right method is use that logical analysis to not, to take the data of the senses. You have to take the data of the senses as you're given, as representing reality, your context with reality. But then you have to analyze it and understand it, and use the cognitive tools that you have. And he basically invented a whole or developed a whole cognitive toolkit. He literally called it the organon, which basically means your toolkit, to try to be able to analyze and understand what your senses are telling you.
Sometimes A equals A.
It certainly does.
Now, in spirit of your very optimistic and upbeat title and book, I feel like we should end returning to the positive. And so my final question I'd like to ask you is, considering that at times this virtuous cycle is thrown off its kilter, how do we return to it?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things. One of the things that we were talking about the early Greeks, the Thales and Anaximander, the people who come from him. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is, you could say Thales was a philosopher, but he was also a scientist. He was also a mathematician. And so one of the things that I think a lesson we need to take from the ancient Greeks is oftentimes, if you say so for example, this, his development of a first geometric proof. Was that an achievement in geometry, or was it an achievement in philosophy? Well, it was both. It was one by way of the other. He was trying to figure out how to develop new knowledge in geometry. And in the process, he discovered, here's a whole new way of gaining knowledge. Here's a whole new way of proving something, right? So he in the process of doing something in a specific, of trying to gain knowledge in a specific field, a specific idea that he wants to prove, he developed something that is of much broader and more important sort of philosophical and epistemological importance. And so one of the things I want to do is take from the ancient Greeks and from the classical era is breaking down the difference between, philosophy as this abstract discipline versus the other sciences. I actually have a thing that I think, my view is that no one should become a philosopher unless he has been something else first, right? So,
I love that.
that you should go out and acquire knowledge. In my case, my own small forays into philosophy don't just come from, I studied it in college. They come from my career as a journalist, of going out and observing what's going on in politics and how events unfold over a period of decades. From that, I'm able to draw certain conclusions. So, you should go out and acquire some field of knowledge, some field of specialized knowledge and specialized methods. And that gives you the grounding and the foundation on which then to arrive at more substantive, a more sound and substantive philosophical conclusions and understand philosophy at a much deeper level. I think, if you want to talk about, epistemology, the people you should be learning epistemology from are the scientists. And if you actually go back, Locke had some really fascinating things to say about epistemology. Sorry, not Locke, Newton. I say I'm going to the philosopher. Isaac Newton had some fascinating things to say about epistemology and about how he went about, discovering the principles of physics and mathematics that he discovered. So, so part of it is break down, be more like the Greeks, where philosopher meant basically a lover of wisdom, and often included somebody who was both a scientist and a mathematician and a philosopher. So the unity of those things and the connections between them, I think, is important. The other thing that I think we need to take from the Greeks that I really strongly, I haven't written much about it, but I think it's a direction I want to go, is the idea of philosophy as a lifestyle or a way of living, or as a discipline. Now we think of philosophy as a discipline in the sense of an intellectual discipline, a field of knowledge, a field of theoretical knowledge. But I think of it more in discipline in the way that a monk would use the word discipline, or philosophy as a spiritual discipline, as something that you use to shape the way you live. And so I think that's something that the ancients, the Greeks, really had that idea that to be a philosopher was not just, I'm a guy who talks about theories. It was also to have a certain approach towards life. The unexamined life is not worth living. It was to have a certain approach to life, a certain thoughtfulness, a certain attitude towards things that then shaped everything that you did and shaped your whole personality. And so I think we need to also think of, so one of the things I talk about in my book is something what I call the metaphysics of normal life, because it's a phrase I keep seeing pop up everywhere. Especially, most recently, I've heard it come out a couple of times from like China and Iran and Ukraine, where these people are fighting against a dictatorship or fighting against an oppressive system, and they say, we want a normal life. And I'm thinking, well, who told them that was normal? How did they derive this idea that that's normal? And normal is this very when you think of it, it's this very metaphysical concept, right? Because normal doesn't just mean statistically normal, because, if you were in Iran, modern liberal democracy is not a statistical normality for you, right? The country has never really, they had brief periods of parliamentary governance, but they've never really had a modern secular liberal democracy. It means something not statistical and not historical, but something metaphysical, something philosophical. And so I think that this idea of normal life sort of indicates this idea that this overlap between lifestyle, the actual like daily texture of how people live, the kind of society they're in, how they feel about things, that embodies a certain philosophical outlook, right? And so that idea of normal life is a philosophical outlook embodied in a certain way people act and look and behave, in a certain way society is organized. And it embodies much more than just philosophy or just politics. And so I think that breaking down the difference between philosophy as an abstract theory and philosophical ideas as abstract theory versus as a way of life, I think is another thing we need to take from the ancient Greeks.
And I think that has become a bit more popular with philosophies like Stoicism, for instance, that people kind of realize that just reading about Stoicism doesn't do it. You've got to kind of live the lifestyle of a Stoic. You've got to, take your cold showers and write in your journal,
Well, yeah, the problem with Stoicism, though, is Stoicism was a pessimistic philosophy from a pessimistic era, or for the most part. I mean, there are different Stoics, but a lot of it, I think it was Epictetus, who was a slave, and he talked about how, he could, his big boast was that while his master was beating him and breaking his arm, he could still maintain his inner equanimity and inner calm because of his Stoic discipline. And, that's how Stoicism comes down as a figure of speech, right? Stoicism means the ability to endure pain and privation and suffering with equanimity. And it's so unnecessary in today's world, right? Because we live in a world of wonders and marvels where we don't have to, illness and pain and fear and being enslaved. All these, if for somebody living in a modern scientific, industrial, and especially in a free society, this is all totally alien to us. We don't need to have this pessimistic philosophy of overcoming pain and privation. I think there are certain ideas we can take from the Stoics that are good, but I think we need to have a mental discipline of how to live in a prosperous world with advanced knowledge and to pursue happiness. So I think the pursuit of happiness, but in a thoughtful. Mindfulness is this term that sort of got borrowed, in the West. It got borrowed by sort of this kind of goofy New Age mysticism, but I think mindfulness or thoughtfulness, or this idea of living the examined life, of thinking as a way of life, but thinking as a way of life in the pursuit of, in the service of the pursuit of happiness. I think that's what we have to have that's different from the Stoics. So like the same sort of idea of a mental discipline or spiritual discipline from the Stoics, but towards a happier goal.
Well, I'm a huge proponent of the art of cherry picking, and that there are wonderful concepts, I think, in Stoicism that even just the idea of trying to anti-fragilize oneself, because you never know what's going to happen, to be happy with less, to not just seek abundance necessarily, to be grateful for it, but to also steel oneself against I've spoken to people who actually said sometimes Stoicism was more helpful for them at their highest points of wealth and celebrity and fame. So it can work in an era of abundance. But I agree. I also think there's some great things from the Epicureanisms and the pursuit of happiness. And so personally, I like to be eclectic. I think Cicero had it right on that one. So
Epicurus is definitely better than Epictetus.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rob. I think you've given everyone a lot of food for thought. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. And I'll put links to your book as well down below.
I appreciate it. It's been a very pleasant conversation.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.